Maybe your name first
All right, Kyle Faust,
and your gamer tag.
Unknown Force.
Nice, nice. Um, when did you start playing this game?
So I started playing in college. I kind of messed around with it. I actually played 64 a little bit in like ninth grade with a couple friends, but didn't really play it competitively. Um, but should I look at the camera? Or
Oh,
you?
me. Yeah.
All right. Um, so yeah, I played it for a while with friends. When Melee came out, my first roommate in college actually had the game, so that was the first time I started playing that. Didn't play it competitively for quite a while. When I came to my second college, I started playing it. I went onto Smashboards and found out about that because I played StarCraft competitively before that. So I tried to look into taking the game more seriously and kind of picked it up from there.
What year was this about?
That was probably like 2004 or so was when I started playing like in tournaments.
Nice. Did you when you first started playing in tournaments? What was your kind of when you were getting into it? What did you kind of have anything you were expecting and you heard about?
Well, at at URI they had like one or two really small tournaments. The second one, when I kind of knew the game, I won that one. But then, like obviously, I didn't take that to heart much because I knew that most of the people didn't know the game. I figured that there were very high levels of play because I had seen some videos, and I wanted to see how I'd do against those players. I expected they were going to beat me pretty badly. I tried to come in humble rather than believe like, oh, I'm definitely going to win. It's just not a good attitude. When I went to MLG Boston, that was the first like real tournament I went to. I did okay, actually, sort of better than I expected, but the like top player like Azen pretty much annihilated me. um, Ended up being like four stocks both games, and I did okay against like some of the other players, but Azen was the best player there, and at that time I think he was probably two or three in the world. So yeah, he was pretty damn good at that time, and I got like 13th total, but I got lucky to do that well.
Yeah, yeah. Awesome, awesome. Before we go any further, I'm gonna grab some water. Do you want any water?
Sure.
Here. Um, this. Cool. Who's your main? Did you start out with someone and then kind of changed around?
Well, I had a really hard time choosing a main character for a long time. I really didn't even start sticking with Sheik until like after I stopped playing the game seriously. For a number of years, I just kind of always switched around. I used Fox a decent amount for some time, but then I wouldn't do great with him, and so I'd switch to another character in the same tournament. And I don't know, it was weird. I'd put more time into one character, and then I'd play much better with a character I didn't play as much. So then I'd switch to that character, and like even the tag I ended up giving myself, or the quote was like the noob who can't choose a main or something. So yeah, I switched around a lot, and then towards the end started focusing pretty much on Cheek.
Nice, nice. What is it about Sheik that you really like as a character?
Well, I think she's just naturally one of the coolest characters. Being a ninja, and I like the Ocarina of Time. She's just a really cool character, especially even though it was kind of obvious she was Zelda. But I don't know, she's just really cool. I like she sort of fits my style of play pretty decently. I think that just the idea that you can combine speed with a decent amount of strategy, being able to read the other player, she tends to be able to do that decently well.
Yeah, yeah. And like the way my brother always described it was how she kind of chains combos really well.
Mm-hmm.
Like this like unstoppable aggressive feeling. Like that KDJ was mentioning that too.
Yeah.
That there's just this like at least with his style, it's like a very aggressive style. Would you say you have that kind of same kind of style the way you approach a fight or?
Sometimes I would kind of switch back and forth depending on the period of time I was playing. I think initially I played very aggressively, and then I sort of stepped back from that, and especially because I was playing with Crazy Jones, he really suggested playing defensively. So I kind of took that to an extreme and played really defensively to the point that some people were not fans, obviously, of the camping strategies and stuff like that. So then I switched back again to sort of kind of combine both aggression and a defensive style, whichever was most valuable against the opponent you're playing.
And you have to know your opponent, like you're the other character you're playing against, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. It's a combination of the character, knowing the matchups. For me, I focus probably more on just learning the patterns of the other player. I think the game is at the point now where people probably know the matchups better than they do reading the other player. I think that just because their mechanics are so fluid, that becomes a very, very important element. And then at the very advanced levels of play now, it's still a strong element of reading the other player and really studying their moves, knowing how they play, and being able to be flexible and adapting.
Yeah, yeah. When people say the word mind games, I immediately always think of, like Ender's Game and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Like really like strategic and stuff like that. Would you describe it that way, or would you say it's more like kind of tactical, on the run kind of thing?
Well, mind games is interesting, and I don't know if there's like any formal definition for it. If you asked, depending on who you ask, you'd probably get a lot of different opinions on it. I think it's probably the most important element is just really having studied the pattern of the other player so that you can properly predict their movements and then plan in advance what move is going to be most effective. And obviously a good example of it is something like that the other player, when they're close to the edge, is almost certainly going to roll in the opposite direction. They rarely roll towards the edge again if they're already at it. So you plan some smash attack in advance, knowing with like very, very high probability that they're going to roll that way. And then you'll hit them, and does a lot of damage because you're punishing them with a pretty strong move.
That's a really great way to describe it, like knowing probabilities. Like, do you ever see the movie Equilibrium?
No.
Oh, dude.
But yeah, math is everything.
Yeah.
Probability, statistics. Even in psychology, that comes into play a lot, sort of actuarial judgment, they call it. And that's all about statistics, and obviously an actuary in math is someone who studies probability. So with Smash Brothers, it's interesting because someone like Mewtwo was known to sort of know probabilities, but there were times where he would just sort of make them up randomly. And I think people didn't at the time realize like some of the stuff. I feel like the stuff he posted on his page or whatever was pretty accurate, but there were times where he would just say something like, 60% of players roll to the right in this setting. And it's like, that's clearly not accurate. Did you watch like 1,000 videos to make that probability? It seems pretty far-fetched. But I think you could actually do that if you studied enough videos of one player to know that in this setting they're almost guaranteed to react this way, and 90% of the time they do roll this way. I think you can make those probabilities, and the thing, if you're playing against a player that's like a really, really new to the game, you can know almost certainly what they're going to do in every situation. They almost always roll. That's what, like any new player to the game, they usually start off with Link and just spam up and B. And then after they learn how good rolling is, they just roll nonstop in every situation, and then they try to punish someone after it. And so you just know that they're going to roll, and you beat them, and you can usually, it's possible to JV5 stock them.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I mean there's this you're just talking with Mewtwo King and kind of getting a sense of the guy.
Mm-hmm.
He seems like the kind of guy that would obsessively do that kind of stuff to like write down every little bit.
Yep.
Is KDJ like that, or how would you describe their like differing styles between him
Well,
and KDJ?
They're almost like polar opposites in many ways, personality-wise. I mean, it's hard to say because I don't want to say like bad things about Jason. I think, and obviously I'm biased because I'm friends with Dan, I find him a more likable personality overall. I just think he overall approaches the game in a more humble manner. He came in with the attitude of wanting to be the best, but he sort of acknowledged that he wasn't that great to start off with. I don't know. It's sort of hard to explain exactly, but they definitely, like he didn't really place emphasis on like statistics. He definitely placed emphasis on reading the other player, he tended not to often articulate his thoughts about the game, and I think sometimes he had maybe a little difficulty explaining it. It was just something that was, he understood it, but he had trouble like explaining how it worked, and I can relate to that. Sometimes it is hard. But if I was like talking to him online about a certain strategy, I mean, he would know it really well. He could pick up on players' patterns. He could tell me, oh, when you attack, you always wave dash backwards, and that's going to make it easy for me to counter this. So he understood the fundamentals and reading the other player, I think, intuitively better than Jason. Jason was more, he would try to, he almost like, obviously he was compared to like a robot. And a number of people used to call him like the level 12 computer at first because he did play a certain way and he tended to follow a certain pattern. He felt like he had sort of the ideal strategies in certain settings. He eventually learned more of the importance of reading the other player as opposed to just the character matchups.
Yeah. With the the idea of reading the other player, I guess. As you mentioned that Dan was like one of the only people that you saw who, when he got mad, he got better. Mm-hmm. Could you describe like how does it normally go with someone who gets pissed off during the game or starts to show their frustration versus someone like Dan?
Mm-hmm. Well, normally in pretty much any competitive venture, in sports as well as in any type of strategic video game, as soon as someone starts to get too emotional and get really angry, they lose control, they lose focus. So they tend to fall apart. And the second that you see your opponent getting mad, it makes you play better because you realize that they're starting to lose it. This is my chance. They try to take advantage of it. So whereas in some sports, that anger can actually make them, there's some physical benefits to that for a short period of time, and something like video games, that doesn't really occur usually. So it's almost always a detriment. With Dan, what was very interesting to me is that when he got angry, and you could tell, he started playing better and he got more focused somehow. And that seems to be a trait that seems to be relatively unique to him, and to me was one of his definite strengths in the game.
Yeah. You saw him early on, right? You saw his kind of progression, like from when he first came in and when you first were playing him as a noob.
Yeah, we started at a relatively similar time, although I had started playing with Fall River, so I was at a tremendous advantage as a result of that. And I think the first serious tournament he went to was the one I ended up running. And at that point, he understood the game like decently well, but you would never have guessed he was going to be one of the best players in the world at that point. It wasn't until a couple months after that he just started improving exponentially every time he would play. But at that point, he was, you wouldn't have guessed, like, if you watched him play, oh, this guy is clearly going to be one of the best in the world. It's just, people might say that as an afterthought, and it's easy to have the hindsight bias to say, oh, yeah, clearly that guy was going to be amazing. But it's hard to really predict.
He is known for his money matching.
Yes.
Was that something that he did like immediately, and how would you describe his use of that?
That started off relatively early. I don't think he was money matching people the first tournament he went to, but he definitely started soon after that. And it was a brilliant strategy that very few other players were doing. He intentionally knew at first he was going to lose a lot of them, but you have to factor in the money. He was paying maybe $5 or whatever it was to get matches with the best players, and they were going to be taking it more seriously than they would in friendlies, where they almost never play seriously and almost always sandbag. And players might tell you, well, no, I always take friendlies seriously, but it's just not the same energy. And I think especially now, people don't like to play gay. So in friendlies, they're just not going to be, they're going to be super aggressive, and it's not the way they're going to play in a tournament. In a money match, there's more incentive, and they're going to play more seriously. So he had a chance to play them and get to learn their styles and see what it was they were doing and figure out why he was losing. If he had done that only with tournaments, it would have been a slower progression of growth. But getting serious matches against the best players and, yeah, sacrificing a couple dollars is definitely worth it.
Yeah. Dude, you're the most articulate person on this subject that I've talked about so far. I'm going to have to pick your brain because it's just awesome. You're hitting all the points that I was very interested in. You're articulating them very well. So
Thanks.
Thank you very much for coming down and doing this.
Yeah, no problem.
Let's talk about you for a second.
Mm-hmm.
What was your kind of attraction to video games and please be, because I think as honest as possible when it comes to why you chose to go, because I was myself as a very socially awkward kid.
Yeah.
Me and my brother played like games and stuff instead of going out to parties and stuff like that.
Yeah, same here.
So yeah, give me your perspective on that.
Well, it's complex because I started at a very young age. I started playing like pinball when I was like 2 years old, and I started playing Mario Brothers when I was like 2.5. So I started at a very, very young age, and it just naturally appealed to me somehow. I think maybe it's the sense of control, because in a video game you have the ability to really learn to manipulate and control your environment almost 100% if you really learn to master a game. There's really not that much in real life you can do like that. So that aspect, especially to a certain mind that likes order in the universe, I think it is naturally appealing.
Yeah. And with when you're thinking about what kind of when you're as a kid, what kind of did you want to be when you grow up? That kind of a dream.
It's hard to say. Obviously, at that age, I had no idea that competitive gaming would ever be a reality. I think at an older age, I kind of regretted that I didn't play games more often than I did. I did play games a pretty decent amount, but because of regulations and limits my parents would set on me when I was younger, I couldn't play as much as I wanted to. I think that at a pretty young age, I wanted to be a doctor just because I was interested in the potential of some type of surgery that would be less bloody, because I was kind of squeamish of the blood, but I liked the idea of the surgery and I liked the idea of being a doctor for some reason. I guess maybe because of my dad being in the field.
What did your dad do?
He's actually a psychologist too, but his area is in legal testimony, so he works alongside lawyers and sort of helps them prepare their testimonies for trials.
Okay, very cool. Did the legal field ever kind of interest you at all, or?
It did later on. I guess one of the problems with video games is that it sort of detracted me away from a lot of other things. So, while I don't really regret that, I do feel somewhat unfortunate that I didn't care more about my occupation at a young age. I think there's a possibility that if I'd come from a generation without video games or TV, I may have become much more driven to do something like surgery or music or art. But I don't know, things turned out the way they did, and I'm fine with it.
Yeah. Have you read at all about the applications of playing video games to surgery?
Yes, that's Hank Chen, I believe. He's mentioned that, and he's the current record holder now on Donkey Kong. But yeah, I've seen those studies too, and it's cool stuff. It's correlational, so they can't say for sure, but I think it's a very good chance, and that same level of focus can definitely come into play. There's also a really cool study that came out recently of the creativity involved in video games and how these video game players were able to solve this protein folding issue, and that was just awesome. The experts had been baffled by this problem, and these video game players were able to solve it. And this is something that is going to be used in the medical field, and this is big deal stuff.
Yeah. That was just the coolest thing I found out about that. How these gamers solved this big problem. I think it was like with the AIDS virus or something like that, right?
Yeah, it was something crazy. I know it was only a couple pages. I wish I could find the whole thing, but it was so cool.
Yeah.
I definitely am referencing that when I can.
Yeah. I mean, my brother, who's particularly good at Melee, he's complained to me that, oh man, I wish there was more real world applications.
Mm-hmm.
And right there are some. I mean, there's not direct some skill you could use necessarily, but that practice and using the mind. So, would you comment on that, like how maybe a little bit of your thesis writing could shed some light on it for people, how embracing video games would be good as a larger society.
Yeah, I think it's all about figuring out the right level of balance with it. I think that people get caught up on the idea that video games can be so detrimental and there's this possibility for addiction. But if we really study this carefully, it's all about balance. And I think that the games can be exceptionally beneficial, and there's definitely studies to indicate there's potential benefits. I think there's definitely the possibility that it can encourage and foster creativity, which is essential in just about everything. So, I mean, if you learn about someone like Einstein, what set him apart more than anything else was, in addition to not quitting and just perseverance, it was also his creativity. So creativity is an essential component of just about anything in life. And I think that video games can potentially foster that. And I think that since video games are so enjoyable by just about everyone, especially certain kids that have they might have something like Asperger's or ADHD, these games can encourage them in positive ways through like educational games. A game that would teach kids social skills, I think, would be much more effective than a social skills group, especially for the kids that are maybe more uncomfortable, at least starting out, with being in a group. They prefer to like listen to the game, and I think, especially if it's something they love, it's going to naturally encourage them to pursue it.
Yeah, and it's also interesting too because there's this element of Melee and competitive game like console games. You have to be in the same room with these people, and you have to talk with them, and you have to socially interact.
Yeah, and that's the other thing is that, again, this is one of the areas that competitive gaming really demystifies this myth of gamers being socially incompetent. What competitive gaming does is encourage good social skills. The socially skilled players are going to be at a tremendous advantage as opposed to those that are isolated and are like assholes to the other players, because those players are going to have a harder time finding games against good players. The players that are really nice and a pleasure to be around will have an easy time getting games with the good players, and the good players will want to help them out. It's only natural.
Yeah. It's so funny. It's like a little microcosm of natural selection.
Yeah. And it's interesting because it's what's essential is that the player learns flexibility, because the social skills that are encouraged in Smash Brothers are way different than maybe social skills that would be encouraged in another environment. I know especially with the DA, they obviously engaged in a lot of like incorrect language, just using the N-word and things like that. And you would see players seeing, well, they're saying it, therefore I can say it. And it's like, no, no, you don't do that. But I think it's only natural that people model. And if they see the DA as being strong players, they're going to model their behavior. And you would definitely see that. And would lead to altercations at points. But I think it's an important environment to realize that if you have the flexibility to learn where are these social skills acceptable, where are they not acceptable, and how can I learn in the work environment to learn the socially acceptable norms in that environment that will allow me to like do well.
Yeah. The DA too, like there was that famous playoff battle in New York where I guess it was the jeers and the trash talk got a lot of the
yes,
the spotlight.
Yeah, it's pretty famous, especially for someone like Wes. He's very well known for that. I guess he's probably maybe one of the biggest proponents of that really just trash talk nonstop in a match, even while he was playing in it sometimes. and it was a good strategy. It would get under a player's skin for sure. Some people wanted to create like rules to not allow it, and especially in crew battles, it would come into play. And that did play an element in the crew battles that took place in FC that caused some of the players to just fall apart because they couldn't take it. Hugo Hugs, like he didn't take it well. Some of the players on like Florida were just, it was something horrible for them, and it got out of hand, and it was unnecessary in certain situations. I think it was more important to do on like the really good players where you need to take any advantage you can, but in a battle that's already won, it's unnecessary, and I think it went out of hand. But
it was the first. It was the big crew battle FC3.
mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, and I don't think they ever recorded the ones of the East Coast versus, I think it was the South team. It was a combination of like Florida and some other regions, and it was kind of unfair to begin with because the East Coast had a tremendous advantage. So it was really unnecessary to trash talk at that point, especially against nice kids that were not doing it back. So I wasn't a fan of that. I think that when both sides are sort of equally doing it, and if both players accept that maybe this is part of the game, it's a little bit different.
See, it doesn't seem like a lot of the top level players, like the greats, trash talk.
Yeah, it's pretty uncommon. There's only a couple players that have really implemented it into their strategies. There was one Florida player that did it a lot that was kind of unknown, but I know Husband took it really badly, even though Husband won the match. He was not a fan, and I played that guy too, and he wasn't as bad towards me, but it's kind of tough. And I think with a lot of the good players, it's not really a tool they use, and they know that it causes a lot of bad feelings, and they don't want their reputation to sort of be tarnished that way.
Yeah. Obviously, they can still be susceptible to it, though, of course.
Oh, yeah. Even to have one or two people in the crowd cheering against you, if you're not used to it, will make your game fall apart. It's just, it takes a long time to be able to develop thick skin, especially if it's not something you're used to. And for some of these kids, it also brings back maybe memories of things that have occurred in school. And so for some people, it's just going to naturally get under their skin a lot worse, and it takes time. When you really understand that the player is not doing it because they just hate you, it's more that they're using it as a strategy, I think it's a little bit easier to accept it.
It's also, it's interesting, I think it's related to this idea of hype.
Mm-hmm.
There's this one player, Diesel. If you
Oh,
need
yes.
more water, I can grab some for you.
Oh, no, I'm fine, thank you.
Who, at first I was looking at the way he was, like, yelling and stuff at these matches and thinking, that guy's an asshole. But then I realized, more and more, it's like, he's just trying to make the match interesting. He's trying to make it, make the people involved maybe want to, feel like they have a lot at stake in the game.
Yeah, it's interesting because I have seen him, and I've seen Mafia, because they're friends, engages in that behavior too. And, it took me somewhat by surprise. I kind of found it funny. But if it had been a serious match and I was potentially going to lose because of something like that, it would have really gotten to me, I'm sure. Although I guess I'm a little bit more used to that environment. I think it's more about adapting to it. But yeah, he's definitely one of those players. And I know a guy named Alucard. He's a pretty well-known tournament director now. I know that he's he loves seeing that stuff, and he feels like it brings drama. It brings more people to Smash. It just draws a community, and I have sort of mixed feelings on it. If it really does, and those kind of dramas do draw in a larger crowd, I suppose I would condone it, but it's hard to say.
Yeah.
I want to look at the data to see what it says.
Yeah. Especially because it's a double-edged sword.
Exactly.
You can hurt people's feelings and just not have a fun environment if you are in that situation.
Yeah, and I guess I look towards a community like poker, which is a huge competitive community right now, that as soon as media attention got involved, a lot of players just went out of control with it, and a lot of players were known just for their outrageous behavior. Some of the players were good and they engaged in that behavior and it actually helped them, like Phil Hellmuth and Tony G. Tony G is probably one of the worst. And even Havad Khan, who I knew from StarCraft, He, despite being a pretty shy person normally, just went out of control at a tournament, and he got tons of media attention because of it.
I remember hearing about that.
And yeah, he was at the World Series of Poker, and he danced around, and I think it's true, he just drank too many friggin' Red Bulls or something, because it's not, from what I know, it's not his natural personality.
Yeah.
But I only had a small picture of who he was, so hard to say, and that was StarCraft, and that was a long time ago.
How would you describe for, like what StarCraft is in the South Korean community?
Well, StarCraft it's just unbelievable how much attention that game has gotten there. And I loved StarCraft as soon as I played it because I thought it was very similar to a more advanced version of chess. I guess it's somewhat debatable to say more advanced. I suppose there's more mechanics, like physical, the ability to have to do more with your fingers and everything. In terms of strategy, there were a lot of similarities between the two games. But in Korea, it just got so much attention, and it was the first game that I really know of that got the attention that the best players were treated almost like sports stars. And it became something so big in Korea, and the players were making hundreds of thousands of dollars, the top players. So this was revolutionizing the field of gaming, and it was saying, you guys can really make a career just out of playing the game you love. And that's amazing. And they're trying to do the same thing here in the United States, and they have been for some time. Obviously with WCG, that was like the first really big tournament that would just draw in players from all over the world for their finals, and that was for StarCraft. And then MLG has followed a similar format overall, and has just been picking up a lot of different games and saying, well, we're going to have these huge prizes. And so it makes it to some extent a reality that people can be professional gamers in the U.S. now.
Would you? There was a brief period there where it seemed like Smash and MLG had those same kind of payouts. Well, not the same necessarily, but
yeah. And that was interesting because that was, of course, the period of time where in America FPS games are huge, and I'm not sure how much attention they get in Korea. I feel like it's got to be a lot, but for the US, it's been the FPS games that have gotten the most attention, although StarCraft 2 is now giving it a run for its money, and that's become really popular in the US as well.
What does FPS stand for?
Free person shooter.
Is it free person or first person?
First person, I think, yeah.
Yeah. Just for people that wouldn't know what an FPS is.
Yeah. So yeah, those games have been getting the most attention until probably recently. But what happened with Smash is that was a game MLG picked up for a period of time, and then for a while it switched to Brawl, a game that the community became very divided over. And there's I suppose three communities, because there's the 64 community, the Melee community, the Brawl community. There was a group that says, let's unify everyone and try to make all of our tournaments have all the games. But that's really hard to do, because it's hard to run even one tournament, let alone three at the same time, plus all the double tournaments. So it's a tremendous undertaking for a tournament host. And then, of course, there's the members that feel like every game is different. We don't want anything to do with the other game because it's a stupid game, and it divides the field, which I think is not good. But for whatever reason, MLG decided it wanted to focus on other games, and they have been known to switch from game to game. FPS is the only one that they've consistently stuck with. And even FPS, I think, it's Call of Duty, Halo are the big ones. They're still obviously having to change it when a new game comes out, but I'm not positive on that. I don't really know as much about that area.
Yeah. It does seem like even when Melee was part of the MLG lineup, Halo got a lot of the attention.
Yeah. I'm not entirely sure why that was. I think that the Halo field itself just was a much larger group overall. I think that the community itself was much larger, and it would just generate more money. You have to take it from their perspective. The finances is a big element, and if they have to be making money, and I guess Smash was not as profitable as Halo was for them.
Yeah. It was also interesting to me because I went to local battles to see Concentrate 2, which is like the big brawl, this full brawl tournament, and it was funny because they had all these HD TVs lining the walls, but they had to bring in all these honking cathode ray TVs like this guy to play Smash.
That's true too. Yeah, technology is sort of a burden there as well. Makes it a little bit more inconvenient, I suppose.
Yeah. For the Brawl, when Brawl did come out and people started playing it, why such a vitriol between the two communities, between those that really thought that Melee was the best versus Brawl?
It's tough to say. I think a lot of them felt like Brawl was intentionally made to not be a competitive game, which is true. I know that it was intentionally made to not be a competitive game. Nintendo decided they wanted to draw in as large an audience as possible, so they wanted to make it that a really awful player could potentially beat a really good player. I don't understand why that's interesting if the game doesn't require any skill, but that was their marketing strategy and that's what they decided to do. Nevertheless, people still developed a competitive game behind it. The game, since it wasn't designed to be competitive, probably wasn't as deep, although I haven't played it to the same level I have Melee, so it's really hard for me to say, and it's really hard for the Melee players to say unless they've been equally skilled at both games as to whether or not Brawl is just overall very inferior. It's definitely a game that is designed far more on the defensive side. It's far more advantageous to be a defensive player in that game than it is aggressive, and I think that fans are just naturally not attracted to a game. They don't like defensive styles. I think that's pretty much true in almost anything, in sports as well. But obviously it didn't hurt Ali. I mean, he had the rope-a-dope, and that was pretty darn defensive. But I'm sure that his opponents gave him a really hard time about it. But I guess fans just don't find it as fun to watch, and that's probably the biggest part. And then Melee was angry because it was taking away a lot of their players. And had the communities come together and just focused on one game, it would have increased the chances that MLG focused on it. And of course, when MLG decided it was going to focus on Brawl and not Melee, the Melee players felt betrayed because they felt like they were focusing on an inferior game.
Yeah. What sport would you place Melee next to? Like, if you're trying to describe it to someone, so I've heard it compared to various sports in terms of like the mental aspects and like small physical things.
It's hard to say.
Yeah.
When it comes to sports, obviously the most statistically based sport is baseball at this point. That's the one everyone goes towards. I suppose it's just because of my own sport experience, I guess I would say there's certainly elements that you would see in something like tennis. And tennis is a good example of something with players like Connors, who their whole strategy was to sometimes turn the crowd against them. And I know he was the one who sort of pioneered that technique, which some Melee players have taken as well, without probably knowing who Connors is, maybe. But I think there are certain elements that are similar in both tennis and Melee for sure. And I think that the same could be said for a lot of sports. I'd be more likely to say, just because tennis is both singles and doubles, the same as Melee, and there's probably less of a involvement of an overall team. Although there can be crews, you don't see like a team of 8 players playing against a team. It's just not usually done that way unless it's a crew battle. And at that point, they're not playing all at the same time.
It's funny because every time I ask that question, it's always tennis.
Mm-hmm.
Tennis is always the go-to, and I think it's a great choice because it's this very mental game.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to anticipate, go back and forth, and it's very, I don't know, how would you describe it?
Well, the emphasis on mechanics is obviously essential. There's definitely a large element of strategy, but tennis is the kind of game that you could be smarter than your opponent and still lose if your mechanics aren't as good. And that definitely occurs in Melee. There's certain players that would be very good at coaching because they intellectually understand the game really well, but they have trouble following through on the game itself because their mechanics are poor. And that is bound to happen, especially with some players are really smart and they just don't play as much. So their mechanics aren't as good as someone who's almost flawless at it, like some of the top players now. Also with tennis, the emotional side. In tennis, most players, when they get angry, are at an extreme disadvantage. Anger does not help you in tennis most of the time. There's, again, maybe some players like Dan that it just makes them play a little bit more focused and they don't completely fall apart. But that comes only with a lot of practice and diligence.
When you first met Dan, when did you first meet him?
We met in person at my tournament, and we spoke online about a month before that because he was asking me information about the tournament. And so that was March of 2004, I think. Yeah, I think.
Nice.
It was either 2004 or 2005.
What did you think of him when you first met him?
He was definitely a cool guy, like very nice. He, to me, just came across as a pretty likable person, very interested in the game, very interested in understanding how it works, asked a lot of questions. What at that point was definitely willing to learn from the players that he thought were the stronger players. So he was very open and receptive, which I think is essential for anyone. You can't come into the game thinking you're great because then you're not going to learn what your weaknesses are, and everyone has weaknesses.
So you say he was definitely there to learn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I didn't learn until later on that he came in with the mentality of, I want to be the best at this game. He didn't come in with the mentality of, I don't know, maybe I'll do good at this game, maybe I'll be a decent, a relatively high-ranked player. He came in wanting to be the best. And that didn't come across the way he presented himself, but he told me that later on, and I definitely believe it, that at every tournament he had the plan of, in the end, becoming the best.
Nice. How fast did it take him to kind of start ascending those ranks? I know he had a list of people that he had to fight and beat and then move on to the next.
Yeah, I remember him mentioning that, and I know that there were times that players, especially some of the good players, would get very frustrated when they lost to him because they didn't expect it. It's just, especially at first, when you're playing against someone that you initially could beat without too much problem, it's tough to suddenly lose to them because it makes you question your own ability. His progress in the game was much faster than just about anyone else's, but it didn't occur immediately. I think for the first couple months, he established himself as a decent player among just a few of us. Only a few of us really knew about him as a Smash player, and he didn't start going to larger tournaments until he had already gotten pretty darn good. So when he first started going to national tournaments, he already, among us, was known as an extremely strong player.
Yeah. He said that one of his greatest tournaments was one he had in Orlando versus Ken. Were you there at that particular tournament?
Unfortunately, no.
Yeah. What was the greatest kind of moment that you saw him, like when you were like, wow, he really is like one of the best?
There were a couple. The one where it really stood out, because there was a point when, at first I was definitely, I guess, a stronger player overall, but I was at an advantage because I had played with Fall River. And then there was a point when we got to be pretty even, and that kind of caught me off guard a little bit because it just happened so quick and I hadn't expected it. And then there was definitely a point when he was starting to get better than me, although it's still at the point where I could maybe win. And that was probably about the time that he went to MLG, and it might have been a little bit before that, a small tournament in Massachusetts where he played against PC Chris and almost beat him. And obviously at that point, PC Chris was known to be one of the best players in the world. And so I was like, wow, so that explains, like, he really can, like, compete against the best. And then MLG New York, his first MLG, he proved that even more. I saw him starting to annihilate people like Neo and Chillin in money matches and just, like, destroy them. And they were like, what the hell? Who is this kid? And so they were caught off guard. And so also his money match strategy at that point started to make him a lot of money as well. So that's when it started paying off.
Nice. Yeah, there's got to be the point where it started to turn around for him.
Absolutely. And so you have to think about it long term. Like short term, it costs you a couple bucks, but long term, it's going to make you a lot of money.
That's so freaking cool. That's like a gambler almost, thinking about it from the long term perspective.
Yep, absolutely.
You made mention of it as an investment, like every one of those matches.
Right, and that's the idea behind it. And I think hopefully players caught on at that point that it was a very good strategy. I sure as hell was like, damn, I should have done that.
Did you happen to see his matches, any matches against PC Chris?
Yeah. Both at New York and at that tournament before, maybe slightly after that. No, it was definitely before. Yeah, I mean, the matches were very, very close. In this Connecticut tournament, I think it was the second really large one. The matches were very close, and they got recorded, and somehow they got deleted by someone. And Dan was like really annoyed about that. He's like, damn it, I was doing so good against it. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure PC Chris was caught off guard. He might have thought he was playing poorly, but that's because he didn't realize how good Dan was at that point. I'm sure that they had played on occasion before that, but that was really when Dan was starting to prove he was a really solid player.
Yeah. Did you ever get the chance to see like the generation before him? Well, I guess that class, I would say Ozin, Ken, and Isaiah as like the top tier in that very beginning phase. How would you describe? Because their trajectories as smashers tended to. It seemed like they were heading more downhill, or at least away. But as soon as KDJ and M2K and PC Chris started making their appearances.
Yeah. Well, it's just amazing with Ken. I mean, his ability to dominate this game it's almost unseen in any competitive thing I've ever seen in my life, because he just had such a dominance over the game compared to everyone else. Like Isaiah and Azin were seen as his rivals, but like Ken, until more recently, had never lost to Azin in a tournament overall. He'd lost certain games, but not the overall matches, and he'd won pretty much all of those tournaments. Isaiah would sometimes beat him, but I don't really know what the story was behind those matches. There's a possibility that they were always friends, so they always split anyway, so it's hard to know how serious they were being. Isaiah could be ridiculously good, and I think he could definitely give Ken a run for his money at times. It's just you never would really see it happen because they just always split. So, yeah, his matches with Azin, some of them were relatively close, but he just would almost always win. And then there was one or two tournaments where some crazy things happened and flukes where he did lose to other players, I think.
Yeah, there was, what was that one? He came in, I think it was TG6.
Yeah, that's where he lost to Sastifer and Die Superfly, and that was like crazy because if you look at his overall tournament record, I suspect it's probably the best of any player and will remain the best just because he just won so many friggin' tournaments. It's crazy, and he would just always get like first. It almost never happened that he didn't. But that one tournament, he didn't win. And, yeah, people were surprised by that. And I still remember Azin saying, like, I wasn't there for it, but I guess he was like, Sastifer, when he lost to him. He goes, I raped it with my Pichu. And, like, that's how Azin would talk. But I don't know if that was true. I guess it was, because Azin doesn't make stuff up. But, yeah, it was really unexpected. And then Azin won that tournament.
Yeah, there was Azin, I guess, continually was losing to Ken, or at least being foiled by Ken at these tournaments.
Yeah, and I don't know, again, it's hard to say. If you look at tournament records alone, obviously Ken almost always got the better of him. But some of the matches were very close, and there might have been somewhat of a psychological edge Ken had at some point that Azin was just like, oh my god, like I always come so close, but I can't beat him. So that might have been maybe too much for him. I don't know Azin's mentality very much because I've probably talked with him less than I have Ken and Isaiah. But his attitude towards the game has always been much more oriented towards having fun, and he's a very nice guy. I think he's most interested in having fun. I think that was always his largest emphasis on the game over being like super good.
And how would you describe? I mean, I know you just said you didn't really talk to him as much as you had in Isaiah, but how would you describe him as a person and as a person and as a fighter in the game?
Who hasn't?
Yeah.
Well, let's see. I mean, the Team Ben knew him very well, and I knew Team Ben decently well. So the newlyweds, husband, wife, and Oro, I went to tournaments with them pretty often, especially when I was first starting out. So they knew Azin pretty well, and they were usually telling me stories about him, like that one I mentioned with Sastafer. They really spoke very, very glowingly of Azin. I've almost never heard anyone say bad things about him, like anyone in the community, and that's not easy because people would make fun of players all the time, especially on the forums. People would just trash talk one another, and sometimes it was joking, other times it wasn't. But you'd almost never see anyone say bad things about Azin because he didn't trash talk. Chillin, his friend, usually did the trash talking for him, so he really never said anything mean. He was almost always nice, respectful towards his opponents. He really enjoyed the game, so he would play against just about anyone. People had bad feelings towards Ken and Isaiah at times, although pretty much everyone loved Isaiah. They were upset that he sandbagged so frequently in games. And Isaiah is definitely the player that created sandbagging to the extent it reached, because he would intentionally lose to really bad players. And he just didn't care, I guess. He'd go Peach on Poke Floats or something like that, and then he might lose a game, and that was intentionally him just deciding, oh, I'll let this guy win. And I think he did it partially because he wanted to be nice, and he felt like to them it was a big deal if those players beat him, and it made them feel good. And he's like, well, it makes them feel good. I remember him saying something like that, and I don't care if I lose. I don't care if they brag about it. It doesn't bother me. So I feel like his intentions behind it were not insulting the other player by not taking it seriously. He was trying to be somewhat nice and also just trying to have more fun with the game.
Yeah, it's funny that the phrase sandbagging and Isaiah, they go together.
Yes,
So
they're definitely synonymous with one another.
and I do think that people maybe misinterpret it as maybe condescending or not appreciate or making the game happen.
Yeah, and what's weird is that Isaiah, there was a huge contrast between how he presented himself online and how he presented himself in person. In person, he's exceptionally nice, and really he has this really wacky sense of humor that I feel most people would respond well to. I know I did. Online, he was really different. I don't know if it was just super sarcastic, but he would just say random things and insult other people in kind of weird ways, and I don't know if people realized he was always joking. I'm sure he was not really trying to take it seriously, but sometimes people didn't understand it. And if they met him in person, they'd see he's clearly not like that.
Yeah. Just in the very brief back and forth that I've had with him, he said, "Oh, is your last name Beauchamp? That's really cool."
Yeah, I know Dan has told me he would just send him a random instant message. So what's a Krabby Patty? Just random stuff like that. And he went to Hayato's house at one point, and just I guess Hayato was getting in a fight with his parents, and Isaiah just walks into the room and goes, "Oh no!" and then he runs away. And this is just he just did the funniest freaking stuff.
Man, just the footage of him too, it's hilarious. Him in Japan, talking to looking at this guy from Australia. I forget what his name is.
Shaz,
yeah.
Yep.
He's like, doesn't this guy look like a guy named American named Travis?
Yeah. Yeah, he just would say stuff like, I mean, he was really funny in Japan too. He really liked that. What the heck was that game called? It was it was almost like a Smash Brothers type game that was only released in Japan, I think, and they just kept playing that game. It was just pretty amusing. And then like he played almost entirely 64 the whole time, and almost never played Melee, like because he just wanted to play 64 and he wanted to be in Japan like me.
You went with him to Japan.
Yeah, him and Ken and Eric Bach, who's sort of like the film guy of the Smash community at that time.
Dude, that's awesome. I had no idea that you went on that trip.
Yeah, I did it mostly because I just looked at the overall costs and I realized there's no way I can afford going to Japan normally. In this situation, we were going to get housing for free for like over 2 weeks. We're going to get to see Mount Fuji. The cost of flying was going to be almost the only thing I'd have to pay. And I expected to spend more money than I did, but I spent like less than $200 when I was there because we ate at like these restaurants that were really, really reasonably priced. And I mean, if you normally go to Tokyo and go to some random restaurant, it could be a fortune. So we lucked out tremendously. And I mean, all of us felt incredibly indebted to the players for letting us stay at their places. And sometimes their parents would cook food for us and stuff. And I mean, I wish that they had come here. I know Captain Jack is coming, Ryota is coming for Apex. And I was like, oh, damn it. I want to go even more, but...
Yeah. How was Japan?
It's unbelievable. It was awesome. It's the climb to Mount Fuji was amazing. The country itself's amazing. We went to a lot of the temples, to some of the palaces. Kyoto is just amazing. Like, didn't get to Tokyo, but I think that we saw the most amazing things there.
Yeah. How like the culture just is amazing to me too. And,
oh yeah.
You know, it's funny. Dan was describing the differences in the way the Japanese players fight.
Oh yeah, it's very different, and it's a lot of it is due to culture. In Japan, the players are so respectful; it's beyond belief. And I know Ken has made that comment many times. Like, the players like cheered for him equally as much as they did for their own players. Like when he won the tournament, I mean, they have videos of how ecstatic everyone was, and he was getting support from the Japanese players. Like, if that had happened in a crew battle or something in the U.S. And a player from another country won, I don't think they would have gotten that same level of respect from everyone in the community. And that's somewhat of a cultural thing. I think it's also that it just seemed like a really good community there in general. And I'm not saying that the community here isn't good. It's just a different cultural experience. And like even with just small things in the game, like if a player taunted or something, like they just started laughing, and it was like everyone just took it as it being funny, and it wasn't. There was like no malicious things that went on. No people were against chain grabbing. They think it's not fun. So yeah, I guess maybe the fact that there's no money involved also has a factor on that. But yeah, they just want to play the game and have fun.
Yeah, that's another interesting thing. Well, is it because of gambling or anything like that? Why is the...
I don't know. I never really asked about that, but I would be curious. I don't exactly know the reason for that, but I just know that all of their tournaments at that point had not involved money. That may have changed at some point, but yeah, they just focused on trying to make the game as balanced as possible, and they only had like 2 stages on in the tournament, so different rules as well, and their crew battles were really different. The player, even if they were at 1 stock, if they won the match, would go back to 4 lives.
Wow.
So very different.
Interesting. Yeah, the Jack Garden tournament, I guess, is
It's not at the point where probably wouldn't even make top 32.
Yeah.
There's some chance, but from when I was talking to other players, they said this is going to be the toughest probably ever. And so even to get top 32, there's going to be a lot of luck element. There's always some players that just get better pools than others, or you could say, be a Sheik player and have a number of Marths in your pool, and that's going to give you a statistical advantage. Or you could be a Sheik player fighting a bunch of Foxes, and then you're in trouble unless you're really good at that matchup.
Yeah.
But naturally, you're going to be at somewhat of a disadvantage. Or you could just end up with having a lot of really good players in your pool, and then it's much, much harder.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the more really good players there are, the more of a chance that some of them are going to get eliminated in the early phase of the tournament, and there'll probably at least be a couple of examples of some good players not making top 32. There'll probably be some people that are able to sneak by that are still solid players, but probably not necessarily as good as some of the other players in there.
Yeah. Yeah. The what would be the best way? I mean, in your mind, like an idealized world, without anybody, no time limit, something like that. What would be the best way to kind of figure out who was the best?
It's tough. If you're really trying to look at it, you have to factor in that it's very, very hard to really evaluate the ability of a player. Everyone, to some extent, can only understand themselves. You only really understand the insight you have into the game. And sometimes we still can't look at that objectively because we're too focused on, I did good at this tournament, so therefore I've gotten much better. But they might have gotten lucky. To really figure out if you're better than someone, you would have to play them hundreds of times. And it can come across it's pretty clear if like you play 10 matches and you just absolutely destroy the player every match, that you're probably better. But there's still some odd that they may have just gotten eliminated from the tournament and have been playing really badly. They're absolutely demoralized. And then you crush them and feel like, I must be better than them. But that's not the case. Players can definitely have off days. Someone that's demoralized will play badly. That's just a guarantee. And that happens. A player that just beats someone who's really good is going to be sort of on fire and think that they're untouchable and start playing really well. Those kind of things happen.
Going back to Japan really quick, because it's just so cool that you went on that trip. What was your favorite food there? Did you try anything?
Some of the curries were amazing. The
Really?
the ramen soup was really good. I think both a couple of us had the American ramen and thought it was going to be similar, but it's really good there. There were some really good curries. There was some chicken curry that a number of us went to a stand and got it there, and it was really good. The food that Ryota's mom cooked was amazing. That was some type of curry-based dish, and that was definitely the best. There was some restaurant that players went to after the tournament that was sort of like a barbecue kind of place, and that was really good too. So it would be hard to say one. I guess probably the curry for me. Most others would probably say sushi or the barbecue food.
Yeah. And it's funny, in one of the videos, Isaiah's like, hey, let's go get some pancakes.
Oh, yeah.
Did Isaiah take to the Japanese culture? I mean, I know you mentioned that game was kind of like Smash.
Mm-hmm.
How did he and Ken, kind of each one of them approach the Japanese kind of culture?
I think Ken definitely really liked it. There's no question about that. And he mentioned numerous times how great the community was, and he felt to some extent indebted to the other players for making it such a wonderful trip. And I feel like he said it was maybe his favorite tournament. I can't guarantee he said that, but I know he said it was one of his favorites. It might have been his favorite at that time. Isaiah also fit in pretty well. I think the Japanese players were just so nice. I guess it would even be hard for us to know if we did anything wrong because they were so nice that if we did do something wrong, it would be hard for us to even be aware of it because they wouldn't they wouldn't have said anything about it, or at least nothing obvious. Mm-hmm. So, but I feel like the players definitely responded well to all of us. They treated us with tremendous respect. Those that could speak English decently well were definitely interested in talking to us, and I like talking about the differences in the cultures for sure because there's huge differences. And one of the other amazing things was Eric Bach and I were staying with a player named Shaka, and he ended up bringing us to this festival, and we were the only Americans there, the only Caucasian people in this group of like hundreds of people, and it just was so unbelievable.
That's awesome.
Amazing experience.
Let me just check real quick on the time to make sure. Car is not going to be... Cool, so we got 30 minutes until we should move the car. In terms of like Ozen's fighting style, because I know everyone calls him like the master of diversity, or at least that's his title. How would you describe that?
He definitely had the ability to play a lot of characters well. I think there's more people that are good at that than some people realize. I think most good players, if they start playing a character, will naturally be good with them. I think Azen is probably the most widely recognized for having proficiency with just about every character. That, of course, was due to his own strategic style of play, that he didn't need to spend that much time like focusing on a character. He just was able to read the other player well enough that he could play almost any character and pick up on their patterns. And he also focused a lot on characters like Pichu and be able to play them at a level that was far higher than almost any other player could play low tiers at that time.
It's also interesting too, because hardly anybody would ever play against Pichu. So
yeah. Well, that's I know that there were like some pretty decent players, and he would be able to beat with low tier. He almost never did it in tournament, but in pools you'd see him go Bowser or Pichu, and he'd beat like pretty decent players with them. And I know like Chillin would say, because Chillin is the person who's probably played against them the most, that some of his low tiers were like ridiculously good, and he was like, I think Azen should go low tier in the crew battles, and everyone else was like, no, but Chillin knew better than anyone else like how tough it could be to play against some of the low tiers.
You saw that, all that East versus West, like the final showdown.
Yep.
Could you just like set the scene for what was going on in the community in terms of trash talk between the two coasts at that point, before that?
Well, there were two big ones. The almost bigger one, I suppose, was the U.S. versus Japan, because there was tons of, I'll mention the crew battle in a second, but with Japan versus America, like tons of players didn't know who was really better, because Masashi, the best Japanese player according to Captain Jack, had not come to the U.S., and Ryota had made the claim, Captain Jack had made the claim that Masashi had never lost to a player more than 50% of the time. So people assumed that he had to be the best in the world, and they were like, well, how is Ken going to do against him? So they wanted to see which country was better, and sort of they felt like this one example would prove once and for all. And Ken did win the tournament. Did that prove indefinitely that U.S. is better than Japan? I obviously didn't indicate much, but it did indicate that Ken was pretty damn good. With the East Coast versus West Coast in FC3, that was definitely also something open for debate. West Coast obviously had Ken and Isaiah, so it had the top player in terms of skill, but East Coast was pretty confident that they had enough very solid players that they could still beat that group. So there were a couple of very outspoken people, especially on the boards, that were saying a lot of stuff like, oh, East Coast is definitely going to win, and other people like, West Coast is going to rape you guys. So nobody really knew. It seemed like it was probably going to be a relatively even match. And it did turn out to be a relatively even match. It was close. It definitely could have gone either way. And Crazy Jones played a large role in stopping Ken from dominating like he did against the Midwest, because he just was able to take out a bunch of their players, and he could have done the same thing on the East Coast and it could have been over. So shutting down Ken was the main objective, and that's what Crazy Jones was really good at, because he was, at that point, so good against a Fox with his Peach.
Where is Crazy Jones from?
Fall River. And he, his brothers, Savai and Sarath, Hayato and Eve, they were always really good players. people don't often know about Crazy Jones that much now, but he was an exceptionally good player, one of the smartest in the world for sure. And I know that Ken has said that he's one of the players that he feared. I know that there's at least one interview where he said that. And Crazy Jones, like when he was when he was playing well, he made you feel like he could read every move you were doing. And as soon as he picked up on your pattern, you were pretty much screwed. You would really have to constantly be adapting your style and switching it around enough that he couldn't be predicting your patterns, and that's not easy.
One of the things that drew me to Smash was the fact that you didn't have like these preset combos.
Mm-hmm.
Like say for Street Fighter, you'd have to do some odd number of things to
right.
Like Hayuken, whatever. And that to me kind of set the bar, meaning that anyone could pick up a controller and start playing Smash.
Mm-hmm.
Could you kind of describe that, and what are the strategies involved in that, like the mechanics of the game?
Well, it's brilliant because on a simple level, it's a very easy game to learn. There's only a couple buttons, there's only a couple of moves. It doesn't seem at first to be a very deep game on the surface level. Then eventually people will learn that it's so much more complex than that, and there's so much involved. And the ability that there is directional influence, DI, that you can get out of combos if you're predicting in advance what they're doing, and you could live way longer than a player that doesn't know how to DI, who could get grabbed by Peach and die at like 80% when they're at the edge. Like a good player, that will never happen. They always are going to be DIing up. They won't die till a much higher percentage than that. And it doesn't even become a contest for the people that have a basic elementary understanding of the game versus the players that know what they're doing. And then people are like, well, it's all because of wave dashing and L canceling, and that doesn't matter at all. Like, the players can easily stop doing both of those tactics and still wipe the floor with those players.
Yeah. There's a certain like phrases and stuff that get used a lot. I don't know if they were around originally or if they kind of
No Johns.
Well, there's no Johns. That's definitely one. And we'll be interviewing the John at Apex.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
that's awesome.
We found him, and he's going there. So
he was a Crystal City guy, right?
I think so. Yeah.
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 Rob Money used to talk about him,
yeah.
But I never met him.
Is that? I guess Rob Money was the one, or that's kind of where that started that phrase. What is a John?
John is essentially any excuse a player comes up with, and No Johns was thrown around a lot. I think East Coast may have used it the most, even though I'm pretty sure Rob Money was the one who kind of threw it around to begin with, and he and Caveman sort of used it the most frequently because of that player John, who, from what they said, would almost always make an excuse anytime he lost. And a lot of players do that. The phrase was often used in a contradictory manner where a player would be like, no Johns, and still make an excuse anyway, or they would make an excuse and then be like, oh, I mean, no Johns or anything. But obviously they still did. And there's, I suppose if you want to be fair, there's some levels of legitimacy to an excuse. Some are more legitimate than others. I think it's more that players just don't like the idea of the disrespect involved with it. And like, if you're like, oh, I only lost because I wasn't playing well, it is disrespectful to your opponent. Yeah. So that part of it I definitely like.
Yeah. The phrases I was thinking of, like rape, like when you rape
yeah.
like, and like the term like gay and stuff like that.
That's a very good example of the things that wouldn't be socially accepted, especially going, oh man, you just raped that guy. Like, it's problematic for the players that don't realize, yeah, you can't talk that way, especially if they're like, there are times where they might start using that language in a social setting and realize that this is not acceptable. And it could potentially get them in trouble if they say it to like a girl for whatever reason. Like, some people I know I've seen players do that, unfortunately. But yeah, with language like that, I don't know when that really started. I feel like a lot of players, for whatever reason, sometimes used obscene language, and I think that nothing against that. I think that's just how a lot of people talk now. A lot of people swear much more than they used to, which almost destroys the meaning of the swears to some extent. But obviously using the N-word is just never going to be socially acceptable except for a select few people. And And for whatever reason, sometimes they'll use phrases like that, and then everyone else catches on. And especially if that player is good, they model that behavior.
Right.
So it's the second that you see a player doing something, pretty much any way they even talk, players will start to model it.
Yeah, it's so funny. There's a picture of Mango lying down with cash strewn out that says "Ah, rape" in big letter.
Yeah, and I've also noticed that on the West Coast they do it a lot more than they do the East Coast, and that's probably not a coincidence. I'm sure that a lot of the players there used it more frequently than a lot of the players on the East Coast who eventually used it more as well. But yeah, I mean, I still remember the first time I came over there, and I definitely saw it used a lot more than I'd seen it on the East Coast.
Yeah, yeah. And do you think that's a problem? I guess, I mean, it definitely comes up it would be a bad thing to have happen. But.
Well, I think the thing you have to factor in is that for a person who is, even a person who's aware that that language is not appropriate, if their inhibition is down, like say they're drinking, they're going to start sometimes talking that way. And that's another example I've seen. But I think, again, that's a key that people have to learn. Well, when do I talk this way? In this community, it's absolutely acceptable and it's fine. And people actually encourage me to talk this way, so it's okay. Especially if no one's taking offense by it. And hopefully they'll pick up that it's not meant offensively. It's just the way people talk. And that is not the way that they should talk in other settings unless that group also talks that way.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's one of the things that can kind of cause people to be like, oh, what is this community?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a potential problem too. And I know that there's probably some groups that would not respond well to it. For some women, they might find it offensive. And I know that some probably do. And I shouldn't say, I know that there are some that do. So for someone, if someone actually has been raped, obviously it's not, they don't want to hear people talking that way. So I don't know how you can ever avoid causing offense to everyone. It's impossible. If we did that, then we would never communicate at all because you would always risk offending someone. So it's a balance. It's hard to figure out. It's a very complex issue.
It is, definitely. Let's double check here. Cool, we got 10 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to maybe pause here? Anything with SOPA?
Yeah.
Horror.
SOPA and NDAA, they're both awful.
Yeah, and PIPA. All this, what is going on? You know, it's like...
It's so bad. Well, this is what happens when there's the period of like a recession. Yeah. Like they stop paying attention to a lot of these things and they're too focused on just trying to make it through the day. Yeah. So this is often the time in any society when the government can get away with stuff it shouldn't.
Yeah, that's very true. Must be vigilant.
Yeah.
Okay, what were we talking about? Oh yeah, back in Japan, Bomb Soldier. Set the stage for that whole thing, because before there was like kind of a lot of back and forth, like videos were coming out of Japan, Bomb Soldier stuff. So if you can kind of give people an idea of what was going on there and the.
So yeah, Bomb Soldier was a very interesting case because the only knowledge American players really had of the Japanese was through the videos that Captain Jack posted on his website. Bomb Soldier, I do not think, had any videos. If he did, it might have been just one or two. And so most people were like, well, Masashi's the one everyone's building up as being so amazing. So Masashi, Captain Jack, Brown Mario, he's saying these are the best players. He didn't mention anything on his website about Bomb Soldier. Before the tournament, we saw early on when they were making the bracket, Captain Jack told me he was going to have to play Bomb Soldier. And he said, yeah, he's a pretty good player, but nobody thought that he would beat Captain Jack, and he did. And then he just started like basically tearing through the bracket and beating tons of players. And he got knocked into the losers bracket at some point, but he still beat like a bunch of the top Japanese players and really showed that he was an incredibly good Falco.
Yeah. But he was eventually, it was between him and Ken at the end, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the final did end up being him versus Ken, and Ken was in the winner's bracket, so Bomb Soldier had to win a bunch of games. Most people didn't think it was going to, at that point they thought Ken was going to win. It was even the Japanese players thought it was an upset that Bomb Soldier had made it that far, and they thought it should have probably been Ken versus Captain Jack, or Ken versus Masashi, or Ken versus Mikhail, one of those players. But Bomb Soldier won the first 2 games, and it quickly became clear that this was going to be a really intense set. After those first 2 games, Ken was able to come back and win the first set, which won him the tournament. But after those first 2 games, it was really intense, and Ken had to play pretty seriously in order to win.
Yeah. And you said it came down to the wire, or it was pretty close.
Yep. I mean, especially because Ken had to win the next number of games in a row. If he lost one more game, he was going to have to go to the next set. And you have to figure that the person who just won that set, Bomb Soldier, is going to be at a psychological advantage at that point too. So while Ken was known to be able to pull through those periods of pressure, it still would have put a lot of pressure on him, especially considering that so many Americans were placing a lot of emphasis on, are we better than Japan based on this match?
Yeah. The to give people an insight into your idea or notions of Ken, because there are people that either don't like him for whatever reason or another. From your trip to Japan with them, what you were describing to me earlier? What were your impressions of him?
Yeah, I knew Ken a little bit before Japan, but Japan was obviously, since we spent like close to 2 weeks, all the American players together, we got to know each other relatively well, and he was a very nice guy. He treated everyone with respect. He wasn't the kind of person who was nicer to the good players or anything like that. He, like Bach, for instance, didn't play that much Smash, and he was there more for the trip and for filming. And Ken was perfectly nice to him. I know that there was some level of altercation they had at a later point, but they were pretty good friends before that. And I don't know who was responsible for the falling out, but I mean, Ken was very nice to the Japanese players. He was very nice to the American players, those of us that were there. And I sometimes didn't understand why people gave him a hard time. I think it was probably because some of the way he acted at times could come across the wrong way. And there were some posts on Smashboards where sometimes people post stupid stuff. And I know that he, probably because of his level of skill too, was held to maybe higher standards. It's hard to say.
Yeah. With his kind of reign as the king of Smash, which lasted from early on till late in the game.
Yep.
How would you describe his style of play? He was very, he oriented the dash dance a lot into the game. He pioneered it more than any other player by far. Other players eventually modeled and copied it, but he was definitely the one that started it. And it became clear that it was more effective than just wave dashing, just dashing around waiting for the person to make a mistake and grabbing them. Was a very effective strategy, combined with his ability to usually aggressively attack well at the when openings presented themselves. When he got his grabs or whenever he found an opening, he attacked pretty relentlessly at that point, and he didn't make that many mistakes. Yeah, it always seems like when I'm looking at videos and stuff of his battles, that it is mistake free, or almost mistake free.
Yeah, I mean, when people look at it now, they might think he's making a number of mistakes because people are more critical about that stuff now. But at that time, I mean, he won almost all of his games. So if you were to look at the ratio, I'm pretty sure he has the highest win ratio, and people would argue that, well, now people are better at the game. But it's still a huge, huge accomplishment.
Talk about Apex, as this coming Apex.
Yeah. Well, from what I hear, it's going to be a pretty amazing event. I wish I could go, but it sounds like players from Japan are going to be there. Players that haven't shown up to a tournament in a long time are planning on going. Some of them might have been training sort of in secret, which often happens, or they've been going to smaller events to sort of get back into the game or training with really good players. So there's the potential for a lot of players to end up doing well that people may not immediately expect. And it's also just going to be a period where there's a lot of sort of pressure on the line, because it's not often that you're going to see a tournament this big. And hopefully these kind of events will continue. But this is looking to be one of the biggest ones in a really long time.
Did you ever know Chudat?
A little bit.
Did you like at tournaments and stuff? I guess you'd see him and play him and stuff like that.
I've played him in a couple of matches. In tournament, we only played once. So, yeah, I've talked to him a couple times, but like never really in depth. It was more just kind of when playing friendlies, or we were at one of the MLGs. We were talking a little bit after one of his matches, but I don't know him that well.
Did you, because you obviously know a lot more. Hold on. Just gotta make sure.
Don't know too much details about the very beginning. I know that the Punch crew, Mike, he seems to have been one of the players that was there from the start, and he was at some of the very early tournaments, some of the ones in the Midwest when a player named Reciferous, I think Jeremy is his name, was either the top player or very close to it. And I know that at that particular tournament, he was ranked higher than Isaiah. So, and he did beat Isaiah. So I think that was before Ken had gone to a tournament. And then Ken was able to beat him. But he was considered one of the top players, and almost not too many people know about him because he stopped playing. But he was a pretty big threat in the early days. Let's see. I think the first really big tournament was probably Game Over, and that's one that's already been mentioned.
No, it's it's good to mention. Oh, these batteries keep on dying on me.
Oh, no problem.
This one is dead. I'm gonna have to open a new deck. Yeah, the Game Over thing that I created, since it's all fake interviews.
Mm-hmm.
If you could talk about that. Were you at Game Over?
No, that was before I was playing, unfortunately.
Gotcha.
The Game Over players, let's see. Obviously, Azin, Shilin, the newlyweds were there. Oro was there. Neo was there. Pretty much all the DA was there.
Yeah, what is the DA like?
Deadly Alliance is a very interesting group. There's some players that definitely took to them the wrong way, but most of what they did was in good fun. There were definitely times Wes would take it overboard. Some of the things he did with like the man sauce at FC3, for instance, where he like put burning hot stuff and like chilling when he was sleeping, like that's way overboard. But like most of the stuff they did was definitely in good fun, and most of it was perfectly cool. And like Wes was not a bad guy by any means. And then tons of them were very nice players, very respectful. And there were a couple of them that could sometimes not be the best, but most of them were.
Yeah. DA, like their whole celebrated battle, at least in Shilin's lore, of his history of the Smasher that he had online, came down to Ozin eventually. It was, I guess, that round H2YL. That's the
yeah.
But describe to me more about.
I think it was actually the DA that ended up naming them the Ninja Turtles. It might have come from Wes, but I'm not. It was definitely someone from the DA that came up with it. And Fall River was basically the only other crew that sort of posed a threat for them in the northeastern area. So they were somewhat evenly matched, and as a result of it, they kind of became rivals to some extent. Although because they were from the same area, the two groups usually got along pretty well. So Fall River really consisted at first of the brothers, the Sand Brothers, which is Savath, Sarath, and Savai, and they actually have one other brother, but he doesn't play Smash seriously. So they kind of composed the core unit, I guess. And there were a couple other players like Roga, who was their cousin, who also played and was also good, and Kalat, who was also a pretty good Luigi player. And then myself, a couple of the Rhode Island players, since Fall River used to be part of Rhode Island, at some point when we started playing with them on a regular basis, we sort of became part of the group. And I guess at getting schooled, we were kind of, myself and Lowell, Yo-Yo were brought in sort of as crew members. And at that point, like, Sarath was like, yeah, well, you guys are members of the crew, and Korean DJ, he was a member as well at that point.
Nice. What was it like having kind of the crew as a, did you kind of feel like you were part of a team?
Yeah, it was pretty cool, because I don't think, like, either Lowell or we didn't know what was even going to happen for crews, so it was pretty cool when we got to be part of that. And at that point, we were probably not as good as them. So it was pretty exciting. I mean, at that point, I was pretty evenly matched with Roga, but I was definitely not as good as the brothers. And pretty much the same for Lowell. So yeah, it was awesome. And then when we got to play against DA and we got to play against Ken's group, and it was awesome.
Nice. Did you at FC3? Could you describe kind of the aftermath of that? Like, was that the kind of like the final bit of the whole East versus West thing?
To some extent, I think it continued on after that. There's always going to be some players out there that love to stir up controversy and claim that they're the best, and if they can't say that they're that good, they want to be able to say, well, at least my side of the country's the best. That somehow makes them feel better.
Yeah.
So that is always going to continue. But at that point, it was interesting, and I know that Bach actually recorded when Ken was talking about the crew battle, and we watched it in Japan. And Ken was like, so guys, I know why we lost. And Isaiah's like, oh, because of Die Superfly? And he's like, no, it's because the East Coast is better than West Coast. And like, I still don't know if I'm pretty sure he was serious. He might have been joking. But, I mean, the crew battles did seem to indicate that they clearly indicated that the sides were relatively evenly matched. And even though the East Coast got the better, if that had been played another 10 times, the results definitely could have gone differently. So I would say overall, relatively matched. The East Coast probably had, maybe because of the area and the fact that they were able to bring more of their good players, some level of advantage player-wise, but obviously West Coast had Ken and Isaiah, who were both, especially Ken at that point, the strongest player.
Yeah. Die Superfly, he's East Coast, right?
He's West Coast.
He's West Coast, okay.
Yep. He's a very solid player.
Yeah.
At that point, he was one of the best Sheiks, and he hadn't been playing that much before the tournament, I think. But he was still a very solid player, and he did well in that tournament. Obviously, there was a lot at stake there, and he was friggin' nervous, so you can't blame him.
Yeah. Was that your favorite tournament you've ever been to?
Probably not. There was some real life stuff that had happened that I found out from my family that was some bad news, so that was pretty negative. The tournament itself, for the most part, I did enjoy prior to that point, but after that, it made it kind of hard.
Yeah. What was your most, like, your favorite tournament you've ever been to?
Probably the one in Japan. But I'm trying to think if there were any others that really stood out. I don't think, I think that overall was the most enjoyable tournament. It's definitely not, there was tournaments I did better at and stuff, but that doesn't really play a role into how much I end up enjoying it overall. I think if you look at the overall experience, I admit that how well or badly I do has some effect on my mood, but then that's usually short term. The more that you evaluate it long term, you realize that, well, how'd the rest of the event go, and like how did the people I care about end up doing, it has some impact on it, and obviously how well the tournament was run itself. And in Japan, I really feel like it was incredibly well run. The players were very, very nice and respectful. There really weren't any problems.
If you had to describe the community and what it has meant to you, how would you kind of describe it?
It's been interesting. There's some very positive things about the community. Overall, it's a great community, no question, and it constantly changes over time as well. So, if I was to say what I think about the community now, it may be different than what I would have said a number of years ago because it's always changing and there's a lot of new players here. And although I haven't met them, I feel like Dr. Pepe and Armada, who are some of the new really high level players, they seem like really good guys. They seem like they overall just paint a very good perception of a lot of the top players. So I'm really all for people like them.
Yeah.
Definitely support it.
Yeah. And like guys like Mango who have just like have been dominating, kind of like reminiscent of the way that Ken did.
Yeah.
How do you account for someone like that?
It's crazy. It's I'm sure that Mango is someone like I said, I haven't personally met, although I actually did very briefly meet him at some random brawl event. But I didn't get to play him in Melee, and we just played a brawl match, so that nothing against brawl, but it obviously didn't say much Melee wise. So with I couldn't really give too much insight into what makes him so much above the rest of players. I'm certainly interested in that idea, and I like the idea of figuring out what it is that makes that player able to succeed when so many others fail. I suspect in his case, and this is just going off of what I've heard from other players, it seems like he approaches the game with a standpoint that he really enjoys it. So I think it helps that it relieves a lot of the pressure for him, that he doesn't feel horrendously bad if he loses. Yeah. So that probably reduces a lot of the potential anxiety that a player like him might experience. That in combination with he may have a lot of experience with previous games or something that allowed him to transition skills. He probably had good players to play against. So there's always a number of different factors that end up strengthening a player. And I suspect he also probably had even though it might not come across this way, probably a decent ethic of putting time and effort into the game.
Yeah.
Maybe it might not come across with someone like him as much as it would for a player that was known to put tons of time into the game like Jason, but it's almost certainly got to be there.
Yeah. What do you have to say about Jason?
So, Jason or Mewtwo King, he's I met him a long time ago. We actually started playing the game at a similar time, and I was back when people used to communicate a lot on this DC Plus site. He was on there a lot, so they were at the beginning. That was the only place you could download videos. I stopped using it after YouTube came out, but at first I would be on there once in a while. Usually didn't talk that often unless I wanted to talk to a player that I felt like was in the area and I might be able to play against. So there were times where I was communicating with him and he showed interest in wanting to come to the tournament I ran. And so I communicated with him a little bit, and he messaged me a couple of other times, just kind of about random stuff. It's tough to... It was usually just about the game. I can't really remember anything else. So he, especially at that state in the game, when he first started coming to tournaments, he received a lot of hatred from people. I think because he ended up posting a lot of stuff online about all these Smash statistics, and players maybe expected that he was going to be really good, and when he showed up to this tournament and was didn't obviously strike anyone as being an amazing player at that point. Some people sort of laughed and mocked that stuff in combination with how he tended to treat other players. I still don't know if it's something intentional or if it's something that he was just naturally having some level of trouble with, to some extent alters my perception of him as a whole, and I just don't know the answer to that. But there was definitely things he would do that would rub people the wrong way, especially at that point.
Yeah, yeah. He seems like a kind of guy that strikes two chords at the same time, and he's an amazing player, and still is. He's just an amazing player to watch. But he definitely, like you said, he kind of can rub people the wrong way. It's. I remember actually I handed him a power bar at the tournament because he hadn't been eating, and I was like, "Hey man, are you?" I just gave him one. He's like, "Oh, thanks." He just seems like he's so obsessed with it that it's like blocks out everything else, including eating.
Yeah, there is that clear focus, and it's a very strong focus on the game that is interesting to see in some ways, and in other ways it sometimes it can bother people. I know that before the MLG Philly, I think it was, that was the first time I spent more time with him, I suppose, like personally, just because we were PC Chris, myself, and Jinx, and a number of other players were there at Mookie's house, I think. Shoot, sorry, I forgot the Smash name, but I think it was Mookie, but a Samus player. But we were at his house, and Mewtwo was also there, who he had originally been at some other player's house, and some altercation had occurred, so that he had to switch over there, and I think he got in a fight with the guy. Again, I don't know who's to blame there, but he ended up presenting himself. He would often, it didn't take long before he was insulting some of the other players. He made some comments about, like, oh my god, that the player DI'd really bad there when we were like showing parts of a crew battle or something from, like, with Ken DI'd Kilo OR's rest like really well at that time. Not too many players had seen it, and he was like, well, that's easy to do. And I mean, maybe he was right. It actually wasn't that hard to do, but I guess a lot of people hadn't seen it at that time, so it seemed impressive. He made a comment that, like, PC Chris's Sheik had gotten much worse or something, when obviously PC Chris is a pretty good player. So it's, I don't know. I mean, I don't feel like he would say something like that to intentionally, like, insult the person. I think he just kind of said it or thought it, and so he said it. And Chris is like a really easygoing guy, so he didn't take it badly at all. But another player, a couple of the other players there definitely did take offense when he made some insulting comments towards their game, or said, like, oh, I knew you were going to do that, or would start laughing after he did something, like, to kill them. So some people definitely didn't respond well to it.
Yeah. I'm trying to think. I have a question. You've hit so many good things already. I'm trying to think of anything else I can ask you to inform the series. Is there anything you can think of?
Well, let's see. What other big events were there? Were there any, like, particular tournaments you wanted to focus on? Or?
Well, definitely we're going to hit, like, some of the early ones, like TG4 and TG5 and TG6.
Yeah.
I lost my battery there. The tournament... Sorry, one sec. No, not that one. Did you ever go to any of the TGs? That was kind of early on.
Yeah, that was before I started playing.
Yeah.
Let's see, probably the biggest events were getting School 2 was a big one, FC3 was a big one. A couple of the bomb events were pretty big. Let's see. A number of the MLGs. MLG New York City, when PC Chris first beat Ken, that was a huge deal.
Yeah.
Actually, that might have been the most exciting.
Yeah, how was that?
Because with that one, that was unexpected for sure. Like, that was a time when people knew PC Chris was a good player. And for a long time, he'd been a very solid player who, at times, his results wouldn't show how good he was. So, various things happened, and I'm not sure what. But during this particular tournament, he was playing really well. And he had come close to doing like super well in a number of events and was getting like high places. But at this one, he had just done really well throughout the tournament. And it was at the point where Shootout did not want to play him. And usually what ended up happening was either Ken, Isaiah, or Chu would almost always just split the top places. And so those games would never happen. And like Ken and Chu were trying to figure out which one should play PC Chris first, and she was like, I don't want to do it, I think. And I'm pretty sure he beat Chu at some point or another in that tournament. And then obviously he faced Ken in the finals, and the matches were really intense. And this was again where a little bit of trash talking came into place for sure. And most of it was not badly intentioned, I think. Most of it was more just people saying kind of funny stuff. They weren't like insulting Ken or saying bad things about him. He was at some level of a disadvantage because he only had some people cheering for him. And like you also have to figure that because PC Chris is on East Coast and then he's also very likable to begin with, he's going to get tons of people cheering for him. So he definitely had the crowd on his side and then was also playing well. And Ken put up a really good fight, and people thought that Ken was still probably going to win, but PC Chris was able to pull it off, and it was a really good set.
Yeah. How would you describe that like atmosphere? Was it just generally kind of like
tons of energy? I mean, it was a lot of hype, and even players that were normally kind of quiet, like I myself am usually pretty reserved. Like it had some level of effect on you. I found myself like pretty excited towards what was going on, and like I was sort of rooting for both sides. At that point, I probably knew PC Chris better, so it was hard for me not to root for him to some extent. At the same time, I also like Ken, so but yeah, I mean, the crowd was just super hyped. Everyone was being really loud, and there was just tons of energy in the room. And when PC Chris won, especially because most of the crowd was supporting him, people were just so excited because they were so used to seeing Ken just win tournament after tournament. So something like this had not happened in a long time.
Yeah, what was that? As soon as it was over, as soon as he had won, like that was like a big shift, right? Like that was like the first time that Ken had been dethroned.
Yeah, pretty much. That it made it clear that Asin wasn't the only player that Ken had to watch out for that was on the East Coast, and that it also sort of demystified the idea that like Ken had been untouchable for so long, and so that gets into people's heads. Even if people were coming close, that didn't matter. It was whether they won or not that impacted the crowd, and so people on the East Coast, people on the West Coast started to tell themselves, well, maybe I can beat this guy.
Yeah, it's interesting. Kind of brings in the whole like image of this impenetrable wall.
Exactly. I mean, the image is a huge thing in the game, and because Ken was able to win tournament after tournament, and like there were some cases where in one of the MLGs, like Wife came really close to beating him, and a lot of people will just be like, "Oh my God, Ken was playing so bad during that," but that shows Ken's level of skill in a way that he was able to overcome that. Because just imagine how bad he would have felt if he had lost that match. Like people would have been chastising him for a long time, that's for sure. And it's not that Wife was a bad player, but like people just didn't really beat Ken at that time. So he was able to pull through matches like that, and that just made people think even more like this guy just will not lose.
Yeah. It's funny. Did you ever like know wife and husband at all?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. At the MLGDC, they provided. We all stayed in sort of like the same hotel room, so I got to know them relatively well. And had I probably lived closer to them, I probably would have been pretty good friends with those guys. Especially at that point, I we seemed to like each other a decent bit. Like over time, I guess, just because there's obviously a distance community-wise between DC and Rhode Island, I didn't see them that often. But yeah, I mean, I saw obviously Eric Bach in Japan. I got to know him pretty well, and yeah, they're a nice group, and I guess they're another group that has a little bit of controversy behind them, especially husband for the stuff he would say about Florida. Um, and again, he's another one who I feel like he's definitely not the kind of personality to have done it like to make the players unhappy or to like try to make them feel crappy, that it was more just to be funny. Because he was not a nasty guy by any means. He was a pretty good person.
Yeah. It is funny. There's a lot of footage of him
Yes.
going off on Florida.
Yeah, and he's another player that got a lot of people insulted his play style a lot of the time, especially early on. There's a number of videos of him when he was not that solid of a player, and people would be like, "Oh my God, he sucks," and a lot of people ran into that. If what ends up being posted online plays a large role on your overall perception. Some players that were really good, their matches just didn't get recorded at the times they should have, so people didn't know that they were good. Some players would get like a match recorded where they played really well, and people would be like, "Oh my God, that guy's amazing." So sometimes people have given players a hard time when they have made that comment, but it's definitely true. Sometimes it can actually work to your advantage. Some players that have bad matches of them online, people think they suck, and then when they play them in person and that player ends up being good, they're not ready for it.
Yeah. It's a lot of reverse psychology in there.
Mm-hmm. I do know, obviously, that certain players were very unhappy with some of the matches that were recorded of them and that were not recorded of them, or that were recorded and then not put online, and were very upset about that. And again, that's where you have to look at it from a strategic standpoint and be like, do I really care what these people think of me online? It should be, what's the result of this? Is this something that can actually work in my advantage? And sometimes it can work in your advantage for people to think you're amazing, but other times it can work in your favor to have the reverse be true.
Yeah. What do you think the future of Smash is going to be?
I've wondered about that. I would really like to see it continue. I've thought for a long time that players have almost always had the perception that the game is like played near its top level. Even a number of years ago, there would be a lot of players that would argue, "Oh, people are so good, they play almost perfectly," and that's not the case. There's always tons and tons of growth that can take place, and even now, like there's still tons of mistakes players make. It's just the more you really study and learn the game, the more you see that there are openings players leave, sometimes intentionally, but oftentimes not. There are mistakes that will occur. There's a lot of patterns that these players have that you can pick up on, and if your mechanics are good enough, you can punish them for. You can even plan far enough ahead in advance that you've studied how they adapt when a certain player does a certain style. Like if you know that player will, again, sort of an example of like tech chasing or rolling, if you know that the player normally will tech to the right and then the left and then the right again, and they will do that every time unless they start getting grabbed, in which case they will switch to right, center, left, center, right. But then you know in advance they're already going to do that because you've studied their games enough to know that. Like, tons of stuff like that comes into play.
Yeah. And the new version of Smash is going to come with I imagine it's going to be one of the first titles for the new Wii.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think they're going to continue down the road and make it a very user-friendly experience, or
Nintendo really needs to be strategic about this, and they need to be, if they're smart about this, they'll realize that making the game both playable on a competitive level and a beginner level is greatly to their benefit. in every possible way. I hope that they would look at esports and see something like StarCraft 2 and see the potential of making their games more competitive works greatly in their favor and can generate them much more money. If they start supporting large tournaments and they're getting tons of money, not just from the players, but from spectators as well, or they can start like broadcasting the matches online and every time a commercial is played, they make money for that. That will generate them way more money than just making some stupid game like tic-tac-toe that is not, it's going to be fun for a while, but then even the beginning players are going to be like, well, this doesn't require any skill, so it's going to get old fast. So if they're going to be smart about this, they should really, what I think they should have done more with Brawl is to talk with some of the top players and learn what was done right about that game and what was done wrong. Because Melee might have been an amazing game, but it's got some levels of flaws like any game does. And I think you could make it better.
Yeah. And then now out of Melee, the future of gaming in general, where do you see that going?
I continue to see it growing in most cases. I'm very interested to see where it goes because I think that the more media attention it gets, as soon as it starts to generate enough money, that is going to get sponsors. As soon as you get sponsors and you're generating more money, you are going to get more interest from a larger audience of players. And the level of the games will just keep going up. So it's, I look forward to seeing what happens. I'd really love to see that America become like Korea and respect the players that are doing these games because they have the same level of skills that you see in competitive sports. And from a strategic standpoint, they might be even better at that area, but you won't be able to see just how well it can be developed until you get a much larger audience and you have tons and tons of potential good players and people are really putting even more time and effort into the game.
Awesome. Cool. Was there anything else that you wanted to talk about? You hit everything so well.
Nothing really comes to mind immediately. I don't know. Is there relevance behind mentioning sort of like the direction for, I guess maybe like what people want to do with what video game players want to do like afterwards or like career-wise? I don't know.
After tournaments and stuff, or after being professional players?
Yeah, I think it might be something interesting to discuss.
Yeah, absolutely.
Potentially. Because I think that what can happen at times is that we're at this point now where there are definitely video game players that are going to say, oh my god, look at this, I can actually make a living off of playing these games. Not realizing that, and I saw this happen, and this was unfortunate with Smash, is that there were people that said, I'm not going to take school seriously, I'm not going to take academics seriously because I can make a profession off of this. Not realizing that MLG was ending up not going to sponsor the game, and so there wasn't enough money for a player to support themselves. Like, even if a player has exceptional dominance over the game, like Mango, I could be wrong, but it would be pretty damn hard to make enough money to like really be well off from playing Smash. So it would be hard to do professionally at the point it stands now. That I hope that changes, and I hope that it might be possible to get more sponsors and the players can get paid well enough that they can make a living off of the game. But I think players need to be aware of how hard it can be sometimes to get sponsored on these things, or even with a game like StarCraft 2, how hard it can be to make a lot of money off of these games. And in choosing whether or not they're going to like take time off of school to pursue video games professionally, I think they have to sort of really weigh the options and realize that this is not something that's going to be easy, and it might be really fun, but there's going to be times it's going to be really hard. There's going to be times that you could potentially lose a match that could end up paying your month's rent or something. So there's a lot of pressures involved, and I think it's important for players to sort of be aware of just how hard it may be, and also like what types of games are generating enough money that they might be able to be professionals, or figure out a new way to approach it, something that someone hasn't thought of, like stream videos and run enough commercials that you can stream like Smash games for 10 hours or something and make a ton of money. Like StarCraft players are doing that all the time. So these are the kind of ideas that people should be trying to play in a little bit.
Totally, totally. Like, I know that the guys who are putting together Apex are really trying to make it more sustainable and grow it, get more sponsors, and they're opening up it. They're gonna have Magic the Gathering part of the tournament. I think Pokemon cards too, maybe.
Oh, really?
Maybe. They have all 3 of the Smash games there, and some other fighting games too. So I think that, and maybe they're approaching it from kind of like a shotgun kind of perspective, kind of making like as part of a pantheon of great games.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
It's so funny because it's such a deep game. You can have we do have whole tournaments just devoted to Melee.
Oh, yeah. If you were to really interview someone about the in-depth analysis of this game, I don't know how well players can really articulate it. In most of the commentaries I've seen, you tend to see a very basic level of discussion. It's very hard to really understand what's going on into every decision being made. And some of it is speculative, because players are going to say, well, he certainly meant to do this, this, and this, but he must have messed up there. But the player might have meant to do that. So it's somewhat of a guessing game, and it's just very hard to really explain everything that's going in. You would need to almost watch the game in advance and have talked with the player to really understand and have insight into everything being done. Yeah. So it's very, very interesting because it's a game that works on so many levels.
It's so cool. I think you might have done it, man. I think that was it's a game that works on so many levels. Is there anything else you wanted to mention that might be worth talking about?
I guess, I don't know, the perspective on maybe how the scientific community is approaching it. I don't know if that has like relevance or anything, but
you definitely hit on the that great puzzle thing that was used, and also the surgery one. Was there anything else that as the scientific community is now doing with kind of video games to?
There's some emphasis on studying whether educational games are effective. There's some studies that are being done now that are looking at whether or not the games can be used for sort of the social skills stuff, that type of development. Some other stuff like diabetes awareness studies. I guess the only other thing is I've wondered about this, how like society is at large views their perception of the game. I don't know how important that is sometimes, because obviously there's a huge mainstream in sports of the audience members usually don't understand the game at a very deep level. They tend to understand it on a more simple level overall. Some people obviously understand it much better, but I suspect something else draws them to that game, and I think whatever those elements are, it's important to figure those out, and if we can channel those same elements, which I think people are already doing, into the competitive gaming, I think it could potentially be just as successful.
Yeah. Cheerleaders.
That always helps. I mean, I know that the media plays a large role on any female gamer, especially if they're like somewhat attractive. They just care about that stuff.
That's true. Yeah, Lara Croft.
Well, and it's also interesting though, because obviously the female player is not. There's nothing that separates them from. Gender has no way of playing a role in the game itself, obviously. No one's at a disadvantage because of their gender. Maybe there's even somewhat of an advantage if a player is attractive. I guess they're going to get more attention and possibly more attention from good players. Yeah. So But in terms of the game itself, like obviously there's no I don't want to say that. There's nothing that would potentially set the best. There's no division of gender, is what I mean to say. The same as you would see in like poker. The best player in the world could easily be female. If there was a player that was good enough, it wouldn't matter.
Yeah. That's true. It's a very egalitarian kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
You can any video game.
Oh yeah, definitely. It plays into different factors, and I don't know. To me, it's just really cool because I like the part of poker where the best player could easily be female, because it's just the strategy element is the most important component, and of course the mechanics, but that has nothing to do with gender.
Yeah. Oh no, my boob got in the way. Yeah, it is very fascinating. And what's it was called? I keep forgetting it. Grab the Coins. There are definitely a few female players there that were good. Definitely got out of pools, and I didn't.
Yeah, there's been a couple of them over time. Probably the best one, I think, would be the Australian player Emily, because she got like third in a big tournament. That was the tournament in Atlanta, Georgia, I believe. She beat husband. She did pretty well against Mike G and wife, and she got third.
Damn.
So that was pretty impressive, I think. And then, I mean, yeah, she's probably got to be the best player. And I mean, at that time, she would have been relatively high ranked. Just in any case, like gender has nothing to do with it.
Yeah. Maybe look up Emily. I hadn't heard of her before.
Yeah. She's not that well known for some reason, but I guess it's just because she was from Australia, so she only made it to like one big U.S. tournament, and she probably would have done well if she'd gone to others.
Yeah. Should look into her. That's a big part of it too. I want to take a look at women's roles in the gaming world. Because it's mostly predominantly men.
Yeah, and I've always wondered about that. It's always surprised me to some extent, because there's clearly, in terms of the gameplay itself, there's no advantage that men would have. For some reason, I know there's been some people that are maybe chauvinistic in poker that have thought that like being a man gives you more assertiveness or something. But I don't know. I think that's garbage. It seems like a very even playing field, and if anything, it could potentially be used as somewhat of an advantage if they were attractive, which I know is kind of dumb, but it just works that way, unfortunately. So I think it may be that they do experience they tend to experience a poor attitude from some male players. Like on YouTube, you always see these stupid people. Like the second that a girl isn't interviewed, there's a bunch of these comments from people on like how either hot or unattractive she is. So maybe to always be judged by their looks in that way is incredibly insulting, and it doesn't have a place in the game itself. But maybe that plays a role in why they don't want to be involved in it.
Yeah, maybe a boys' club kind of thing.
Yeah.
Interesting. I wonder if that could ever be changed, because I know that
I would hope so.
women make up a huge part of the gaming world.
Mm-hmm.
Like The Sims and some of these other games actually have a very huge.
Yeah, especially like MMORPGs.
Yeah.
And that's a game where they have a little bit more anonymity. So if they want to hide their gender, they potentially could.
Yeah.
So that probably does allow them to have more freedom, and then maybe some relation to how competitive a game is. But obviously, MMORPGs can be very competitive. So
Yeah.
hard to say.
That's true. All right, man. I think we did it.
All right, cool
we
stuff.
got it in the can.